There's a version of falling for someone that happens slowly, in stages. And then there's the kind that sneaks up on you, over a dinner table on a Saturday night, when the man across from you laughs at something you said and looks at you like you're the most interesting thing in the room. And you realize with complete clarity that Careful left the building a long time ago. Celeste Delaney had spent a year making herself smaller, quieter, safer. And then Orion Quigley took her to dinner. No studio, no mixing board, no professional reason to be together. And somewhere between the first glass of wine and the last bite of food, she stopped wanting to be careful at all. This is chapter 3. No more almost. No more waiting. Just two people who finally chose each other, and everything that comes with that. Subscribe, drop a like, and tell us in the comments if you've ever had a night that changed everything. The story continues right now. The restaurant was exactly what he'd promised. Unpretentious, warm, the kind of place where the tables were close together and the lighting was low enough to feel like a secret. It was on Woodland Street, tucked between a record shop and a dry cleaner, with a handwritten menu on a chalkboard and a bartender who clearly knew Orion by name and had the good sense not to make a thing of it. Celeste had changed 3 times before leaving her apartment, which she refused to analyze too deeply. She'd settled on a dark green dress she'd owned for 2 years and never quite found the right occasion for, and when Orion saw her walk through the door, his expression did something brief and unguarded before composure reassembled itself. But she caught it, and it settled something in her that she hadn't realized was still uncertain. He stood when she reached the table, not performatively, just naturally, the way some men move through the world with a physical consideration that feels instinctive rather than rehearsed. He looked different outside the studio. Same dark Henley energy, but sharper. A jacket that fit like it had been made to. That same unhurried way of existing in space that she'd cataloged over 3 weeks and still hadn't fully gotten used to. "You found it," he said. "I'm punctual," she said. "I noticed." They sat, and the first few minutes carried the particular texture of two people recalibrating, stripping away the professional context that had structured every interaction until now, and finding out what was underneath. What was underneath, she discovered quickly, was easier than expected. He asked about her week without it feeling like small talk. She asked about the album's post-production timeline, and he answered directly, no deflection, and then steered the conversation somewhere more personal, with the same naturalness he did everything else. They ordered without overthinking it. She got the lamb. He got a pasta dish he claimed was the only reason he'd moved to this side of the city, which she suspected was only partially a joke. The wine was good. The food was better. But what she would remember most about that dinner wasn't either of those things. It was the way he listened. Not politely, not waiting for his turn, actually listened, with the same full attention he gave a track he was trying to understand. Like what she was saying mattered enough to receive completely. She'd forgotten that feeling. Or maybe she'd never had it quite like this. She told him more than she planned to. About the friendships, about the specific loneliness of losing people gradually, rather than all at once. About how she'd started writing for other artists, partly out of financial necessity, and partly because it felt safer to put her truest feelings in someone else's mouth. He didn't offer solutions or pivot to his own experiences. He just said, "That makes sense," in a way that meant he actually thought so, and something in her chest loosened another degree. Across the table, Orion was doing the thing he never did, not calculating, not managing, just being present, which was harder for him than he would have admitted to anyone. He was a man who processed at a distance, who made better decisions with space between himself and the thing he was deciding about. But there was no distance with Celeste, hadn't been since the first day, and what surprised him was how little that frightened him anymore. She laughed at something he said about the bartender's opinion on track sequencing, and the sound of it moved through him like a chord resolving. He reached across the table and touched her hand, and she turned hers over without hesitation. And neither of them said anything about it, because nothing needed to be said. They stayed longer than either of them planned. The restaurant thinned out around them, tables clearing, the bartender moving slower, the chalkboard menu half erased, and neither of them suggested leaving. There was something about the bubble of that particular evening that felt worth protecting, and they both knew, without saying so, that the moment they stepped outside, it would become something else. Something realer, maybe. Something that required a next step. The check came, and he took it without discussion. Not in a way that felt like a statement, but in a way that felt like a preference. And she let him, because it wasn't worth arguing about, and also because she liked it, which she noted privately and didn't examine too closely. Outside, Nashville had gone cool and clear. The kind of November night that smells like wood smoke and distant rain, and makes the city look better than it has any right to. They walked without a destination, which was its own kind of answer about how ready either of them was for the evening to end. Their shoulders were close enough to touch with every other step. She was aware of the exact distance between them in the way you're only aware of distance when part of you is actively measuring it. "Tell me something you've never put in the song," he said. She considered it seriously. "I'm afraid I peaked creatively at 24, and everything since has been very sophisticated imitation." He was quiet for a moment. "That's not true. You don't know that." "I've read everything you've written in the last 3 weeks," he said. "It's not imitation, it's excavation. There's a difference." She looked at him sideways. The streetlight caught the line of his jaw, the particular steadiness of his expression, and she felt the pull of him like a current. Not dramatic, not destabilizing, just constant and warm, and increasingly difficult to pretend wasn't there. "Your turn," she said. "Something you've never said out loud." He considered it the way he considered everything, fully, without rushing. "I don't finish most things for myself," he said. "Albums, projects, builds. I finish them because someone else needs them finished. I'm not sure I know how to want something just for me anymore." The honesty of it landed quietly between them. She understood it in a specific way, the particular erosion that happens when you spend years being useful to other people's visions. "That's a lonely way to work," she said. "Yeah," he said simply. They'd stopped walking without noticing, standing on a corner where the streetlight made a warm circle on the pavement, and the rest of the block fell into comfortable dark. He turned to face her, and she turned to face him, and the distance between them was not very much at all. He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, fingertips brushing her jaw in a touch so light it could have been accidental, and was absolutely not. Her breath slowed. "I want to show you the apartment," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, that same frequency that had undone her in small degrees for 3 weeks. Just that. She looked at him for a moment, at the patience in his expression, the complete absence of pressure, the quiet certainty of a man who had decided what he wanted and was willing to let her decide too. "Okay," she said, and the way he looked at her when she said it, like she'd just handed him something he'd been careful not to ask for, made her walk a little closer to him the rest of the way there. His apartment was above the studio, but separate from it in every way that mattered. A different entrance, a different energy, a different version of who he was when the work was done. She noticed that immediately. Where the studio was controlled and purposeful, all dark wood and calibrated light, the apartment was lived in a way that surprised her. Books stacked horizontally on shelves that had run out of vertical space. A record player on a low shelf with a milk crate of vinyl beside it, organized in a system she'd need more time to decode. A kitchen that smelled faintly of coffee and something herbal, with 2 mugs on the counter that suggested he'd had company recently or just never fully cleaned up after himself, which she found unexpectedly endearing. "It's not what I expected," she said, moving slowly through the living room, taking it in. "What did you expect?" "More control," she said honestly. He laughed. The real one. The one that rearranged his face. And she felt it in her sternum. He put music on low, something instrumental, unhurried. A piano line she didn't recognize that filled the apartment the way good music fills a room. Not loudly, just completely. He poured 2 glasses of water without asking, handed her one, and she accepted it and stood near the record shelf, running her fingers along the spines of the albums, while he watched her from the kitchen with an expression he wasn't entirely managing. He was aware of her in his space in a way that was specific and new. He'd had people here before, colleagues, friends, a relationship 2 years ago that had ended quietly and without much damage. But this felt different in a way he didn't want to rush past or minimize. Celeste in his apartment, touching his records, standing in the warm lamplight in that green dress, was something he wanted to be fully present for. She pulled an album out, something from the 70s, a singer-songwriter record with a worn cover, and held it up with a questioning look. He nodded. She put it on, carefully, with the focused attention of someone who had been around studios long enough to handle vinyl properly. And the sound that came out was warmer and rounder than the digital track had been. She turned around and he was closer than he'd been a moment ago. Not crowding her, just present, the way he was always present. That particular gravity of his that she'd stopped pretending didn't affect her. "I like your apartment," she said. Her voice was quieter now, calibrated to the space between them. "I like you in it," he said. And there was nothing complicated about it, just honest. And she felt the last of the evening's careful social distance dissolve completely. She set her water glass on the shelf and looked at him, really looked, the way she hadn't let herself fully do in 3 weeks of sitting across from him. And what she saw was a man who was patient and steady and wanted her in a way that didn't feel like pressure, just like warmth. She closed the small remaining distance herself, not waiting, not being led, choosing. Her hands found the front of his jacket and she kissed him, and he made a low sound against her mouth that told her everything she needed to know about how long he'd been waiting for her to be the one to move first. He kissed her back with the same quality of attention he gave everything, complete, unhurried, like there was nothing else in the world competing for his focus. One hand came up to her jaw, tilting her face gently, and the other found her waist and drew her closer, in a motion so natural, it felt like something they'd done before, in some version of this life. The record played softly in the background. The lamp in the corner held its warm light, and Celeste, who had spent a year making herself small and careful and contained, felt something open in her chest, like a window she'd forgotten was there. He pulled back just enough to look at her, checking, not hesitating. And what he saw in her face made something in his expression go quiet and certain at the same time. She reached up and pushed his jacket off his shoulders, and he let her. And that small transfer of initiative passed between them like a current. He walked her slowly backward toward the couch, and they sat together in the warm dark with the vinyl crackling softly between songs. And for a while that was enough. Just the closeness, his hand moving slowly up her back, her fingers at the collar of his shirt, both of them relearning how to be near someone without armor. He pressed his lips to her temple, her cheek, the corner of her mouth, each one deliberate, each one saying something words would have made smaller. She turned her face into his neck and breathed him in, cedar, and something warmer underneath, something that was just him, and felt the particular safety of a body that wanted to hold you rather than contain you. "You're thinking," he said quietly against her hair. "Occupational hazard," she said. He made a low sound that might have been a laugh. His hand traced slowly up her spine, and she felt every vertebra of it, a warmth that moved through her, like the first measure of a song that you already know is going to matter. She lifted her head and looked at him in the low light, the line of his jaw, the steady dark of his eyes, the particular quality of his attention that had undone her by degrees for weeks, and understood with complete clarity that she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of this, not of him. "Stay," he said. One word, same as always, no performance in it, just the thing itself. She kissed him instead of answering, and he understood. What followed was quiet and warm and entirely theirs. Not rushed, not careful, just two people who had been circling something real for long enough that when they finally arrived at it, it felt less like falling and more like landing. Afterward, she lay with her head against his chest and listened to his heartbeat slow to its resting pace. And he kept one hand moving in long, absent strokes through her hair, like he'd been doing it for years. The record had long since ended. The apartment was completely quiet. Outside, Nashville did its nighttime thing, distant and glowing and indifferent in the best possible way. "I didn't peak at 24, she said softly, into the dark. His chest moved with a quiet laugh. "No," he said, "you didn't." She closed her eyes and felt, with a certainty that didn't need examining, that the silence around them was the best kind she'd ever been in. She woke up to the smell of coffee and the specific disorientation of an unfamiliar ceiling. It lasted about 3 seconds before everything reassembled itself. The warm weight of the blanket, the sound of movement in the kitchen, the low morning light coming through curtains she didn't own. She lay still for a moment, taking inventory of how she felt. She'd expected something complicated, some version of the morning after recalibration she'd experienced before. The quiet anxiety, the instinct to minimize, the careful reconstruction of walls that had come down overnight. Instead, she felt rested, settled, like she'd slept in the correct place. She found one of his flannels folded on the chair beside the bed, left there deliberately, she understood, because he was that kind of considerate without announcing it, and pulled it on over her dress from the night before, and padded out to the kitchen in her bare feet. He was at the counter in a worn gray t-shirt and sweatpants, hair unguarded in the morning way she hadn't seen before, reading something on his phone with a mug in his other hand. He looked up when he heard her, and his expression did that thing, the brief, unmanaged version, the one that arrived before composure could, and she felt it like a chord. "Coffee's ready," he said. "I can see that," she said. "I was being polite." "You're never just polite." He smiled at that, the full one, the one that rearranged his face, and she crossed the kitchen and accepted the mug he'd already poured for her, fixed exactly the way she took it, which meant he'd been paying attention on some morning weeks ago when she'd made it herself in the studio lounge and hadn't thought anyone was watching. She leaned against the counter beside him, and they drank coffee in the morning quiet, shoulders touching, and the ease of it was almost more intimate than anything that had happened the night before. Almost. He made eggs, simple, no performance, just eggs and toast, and the particular competence of someone who cooked for themselves regularly and had made peace with the fact that breakfast didn't need to be an event. She sat at his kitchen table and watched him move through his own space and felt something she recognized as tenderness arrive quietly and without warning. This was the version of him nobody saw, Not the producer, not the industry name, not the man with the unhurried authority who made artists better without taking credit. Just Orion, in a gray t-shirt on a Sunday morning, slightly distracted, reaching across the counter for the salt and humming something under his breath that she was almost certain was a melody from her closing track. She didn't point it out, she saved it. He set a plate in front of her and sat across the table, and they ate without needing to fill the silence. And outside, the Nashville morning was doing its slow Sunday thing. Pale light, distant church bells from somewhere down the street, a dog barking twice and then going quiet. "I have to go home at some point," she said eventually. "I know," he said. He didn't suggest she hurry. She didn't. They stayed at the table long after the plates were empty, talking about nothing important and everything that was. And she noticed at some point that she was gesturing with her hands when she talked, something she only did when she felt completely comfortable, and that he was watching her do it with an expression that made her feel, without a single word, like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She went home that Sunday afternoon, carrying his flannel in her bag because he'd told her to keep it, and she hadn't argued, which they both understood meant something. The week that followed had a different texture than any week she could remember in recent history. Not because everything had changed, but because the right things had. She still wrote at her kitchen table, still went to the farmer's market out of habit, still had evenings that were quiet in the way only her apartment could be quiet. But now there were messages that arrived at odd hours. A voice memo of a new melody he wanted her to hear. A text at 11 asking if she'd eaten. A photo of a vinyl find he'd made at a shop on Broadway, with the caption, "Thought you'd fight me on this one." She always responded. That was new too. The album's release was scheduled for the first week of December, and Dara had invited them both to the listening party, a small industry-adjacent gathering at a venue on East Nashville's Five Points that was intimate enough to feel real and public enough to matter. Celeste almost declined out of habit. The old version of her would have found a graceful exit, would have cited work or tiredness, or any of the other reasonable-sounding reasons she'd been using to keep herself at a comfortable remove from rooms full of people who knew each other in ways she didn't. Instead, she texted Orion, "I'll be there." He replied in under a minute, "I know." The night of the listening party was cold and clear, the kind of early December evening that makes Nashville feel like a snow globe someone has just set down. She arrived on her own and found him near the back of the room, talking to Dara's manager, and when he saw her cross the threshold, his conversation didn't stop, but his attention shifted. She felt it from across the room, that specific gravity of his, reliable now, as a frequency she'd learned to tune to. He excused himself and came to her, and the way he moved through the crowd toward her felt, to anyone paying attention, like a man walking toward something he'd already decided on. "You came," he said. "I said I would. You also said you weren't easy to be close to." She looked at him. "I'm working on it." He smiled and handed her a drink, and stood beside her for the rest of the evening, with the quiet certainty of someone who had no intention of being anywhere else. When Dara's album played through the speakers, all of it, start to finish, the songs they'd built together in 3 weeks of friction and coffee and too close proximity, Celeste felt something she hadn't expected. Not pride exactly, though that was part of it. Something closer to recognition. The closing track came on last, her words and Dara's voice, and she felt Orion's hand find hers in the dark of the room without looking, his thumb moving once across her knuckles, the way it had that first night at the studio table. "That one's yours," he said quietly, for her alone. "I know," she said, and this time, she meant it completely. Later, outside on the sidewalk while the party continued inside, the cold air sharp and clean around them, He turned to her with that expression she'd cataloged over weeks. Steady, certain. The one that arrived before composure could stop it. "I want this," he said simply. "You and me. Past the project, past the careful. Just this." She looked at him for a moment, at everything she'd learned about who he was when the work was done, and felt the last careful wall finish its long, slow fall. "So do I," she said. He kissed her there, on the sidewalk, unhurried and certain, with the cold air around them and the muffled music from inside, and the Nashville night doing its indifferent, beautiful thing above them. And Celeste Delaney, who had spent a year becoming fluent in the language of absence, finally felt what it was like to be completely, quietly, irreversibly found. If this story lived in your chest the way it was meant to, drop a number in the comments, 1 to 10. Let us know how it landed. And thank you for being here for every single part of this journey. It means everything.